This morning, we're going to talk about faith food. Faith food. We're going to talk about faith that feeds on the right food. Do you know that we need nourishment physically? We need to eat things in order to grow, to survive, to think right. If we don't eat the right things, we're finding out more and more that it affects the way that we think, even the way that we feel. It affects our sleep cycles. Food is important. And there's been never a group of people in the world that have had more access to more kinds of food whenever we want it than this generation, especially those of us that live in this part of the world, the United States of America. Historically, of course, this should be obvious, but you would eat food in season. Fruit would be available, and then it would be gone. Certain vegetables would grow, and you could eat them when they were available, and then you either stored them and dried them, or you lost them. Food is perishable. We know that. Sometimes we kind of lose that sense of the reality of the perishableness of food. For one thing, most of us don't do what is required to get food. We don't plant things. We don't harvest things. We don't raise animals. We don't have to go through the process. We just go to Wegmans, right? Or Target or wherever, and we just find things already prepackaged. We don't even have to slice the cheese anymore. Not only do you not have to bake the bread, you don't have to slice the bread. And we have so many different kinds of bread. And, you walk into like a Wegmans anytime, and if those of you that are watching online, Wegmans is the ultimate grocery store. Okay, it's like the number one grocery store in the United States. It is. And you just have to be a Northeasterner to get it, okay? But you walk into Wegmans, and the produce section is as big as most grocery stores, right? And all of the food that's there, and it's always the same. So we get the idea in our minds, and our kids, I think, grow up thinking that just food is always available in abundance because at least it's there in abundance. But in the ancient world, and really in every generation up until modern times, people understood that food came in cycles. You could get certain things at certain times of the year. If you wanted a blueberry pie, you better get it when the blueberries are growing, right? And so things come and go. There's a sense also of urgency in the ancient world. We have to eat, we have to prepare to eat, and a lot of work was related to preparing, getting, storing, distributing, selling, and eating, consuming food. So food was a huge part of every culture. It's a big part of all our culture, make no mistake about it, but for us it's a little different. A lot of us, maybe half the meals we get, we don't even get out of our car to get the food, right? Come on now. And now we've got these apps where you don't even have to go and pick up. Pickup's old school. Just go to Grubhub and just pick what you want, and your steak will be delivered. I had it done this week, I'm telling you. So there's a sense of our culture's really disconnected from what it takes to really produce food, the value of food, and the energy that goes into it, and also the essence of food. Food is life. Food has always been understood as life, and this is still real to people in parts of the world where food is scarce, where resources are scarce, and maybe 40% of the world lives at certain times of the year of varying states of starvation because they don't have access to a varied diet or to the kinds of food that those of us who live in this part of the world do. So we have to take our minds and disconnect them from our understanding of food and kind of get back into what it was like in the 2nd century and the 1st century, and even 1,000 years before that, 1,500 years before that in the time of Moses, to really capture what God is going to tell us today in the Gospel of John chapter 6. Now let me begin by saying this. We're going to read today, and with God's help get through, one of the most powerful, important, and significant chapters in the Bible. It is so filled with truth that it's impossible in one message to capture everything that is presented there. So I'm going to do my best to fly high over John 6 and the passages that we're going to look at. Now, let me just say that we're meeting Jesus in this series of messages through John's eyes. John the apostle, John the friend that knew Jesus best. And in John 6, it's the longest chapter in the New Testament, and there's a reason for that. John is presenting something, and it's very, very powerfully laid out. First of all, John 6 could be divided into three sections. The first section is the feeding of the 5,000, an actual miraculous event where Jesus, through his disciples, multiplied bread and fish to feed 5,000 men, and beyond that, women and children. So they say up to 15,000 or 20,000 people were fed from 5 loaves and 2 small fish. Following that miraculous event, the disciples crossed the sea to rest, and Jesus didn't cross the sea with them. Instead, as they crossed the sea, they entered into a storm, and Jesus walked across the sea over the waters. And this miraculous event, we talked about it last week, is a revelation of the power of Jesus to walk across water and to enable us to face and overcome our fears. And then when they landed on the other side, Jesus began the third section of John 6. Now, the third section of John 6 is called the Bread of Life Discourse, for those of you that are taking notes, and I hope that you do take notes. The Bread of Life Discourse is really a teaching that is set in a city called Capernaum, across the sea, and I say really diagonally across the sea, from where he had just fed the 5,000 and where he had just walked on water. And in this discourse or teaching, Jesus is not only going to explain what the significance of the miraculous feeding was of the 5,000, he's also going to call his people to a deeper level of faith. And I want to talk to you about this because the last few verses of this chapter are rather sad. Up until this point in the Gospel of John, Jesus is growing in popularity, and you feel this momentum building. It's building. In fact, he begins to outshine the most popular preacher of the day, John the Baptist. And even John the Baptist recognized. He said in John earlier, he said, Jesus must increase, I must decrease. And so Jesus is getting more and more visibility. He's been to at least 3 feasts in Jerusalem and has had supernatural events occur. He's turned water into wine, and he's healed many who are sick, and he's taught things that are revolutionary, and now he fed 5,000 people with just a small amount of food. Jesus, in John 6, reaches the apex of his popularity, and I will tell you, it was all downhill from there in terms of popularity. But I want you to capture something. Just because you have a crowd doesn't mean you have a congregation. Just because you have a lot of people that are following you on social media or interested doesn't mean you're making an impact or changing their lives, at least not by the standards of God. It's great to help a lot of people, but God came not just to help the multitudes, but to help you. He came not just for the many, but for the few. And in this passage, we're going to see that God is reaching out his hands to the whole world, inviting all people to come to Jesus. But the truth is, and this is a hard truth that we have to face, not everybody is willing to pay the price to come into a deep, abiding relationship with Jesus. A lot of people are attracted to Jesus when they see what he does for them. But then when he begins to require them to believe something, or require them to have a level of understanding, or teaches them something that is challenging to their cultural, religious, or pre-installed socio-political ideas, they push back. And we see this. We see this sometimes people are drawn to, and I think we have to be really careful of this. Jesus knew how to have big events that drew big crowds. It's great to do that. But Jesus would turn right around, and then he would challenge them with statements and teaching that would sometimes separate the true believers from those who were just being drawn by the miracles. And that's exactly what's happening in John chapter 6. So the third section of John 6, the teaching or the discourse of Jesus, begins in verse 22. And it really goes in 3 segments, this teaching portion. Verses 22 through 40, Jesus is communicating to the multitude. These are the people, many of whom were fed the day before, the 5,000. They had run around the northwest corner of the lake when they saw that the disciples were at Capernaum, and they came there to check out and to see Jesus. And so this is now the big crowd, and Jesus begins his ministry to the big crowd. Then, after he ministers to the crowd, the conversation continues, and we find out later it continues in the synagogue of Capernaum. So he begins part of his teaching to the crowd. Then the second part, it shifts to the synagogue. Now, I've made 6 journeys to Israel and taken people with me all but one time as a student, but mostly as a teaching pastor. How many of you have been with me physically to Israel? How many of you? Raise your hands. A number of you. Okay. You remember when we went to Israel, we went to Capernaum, and we spent a lot of time there teaching you the geography so you get this in your mind. So I want you to travel back to Capernaum. I want you to remember that's where Jesus called Peter, right on the seashore. That's where we taught about the calling of Jesus, calling of Peter. And then there's that beautiful synagogue. You can Google it and see the remnants of that synagogue. It sits, the ruins of the current synagogue sit above the floor of the first century synagogue that is there, some of which you can see, the very same place that Jesus spoke in. The very same place. The stones are there. They heard the voice of Jesus 2,000 years ago. The synagogue is large by ancient standards, but it's not large enough for 5,000 people. Several hundred, perhaps, were in the synagogue for this second part of the teaching. And the Bible says the second part of the teaching was to the Jews, and the Jews, in this case, would be the religious thought leaders. Some of the folks we spoke about a few weeks ago, the Pharisees, perhaps the Sadducees, and maybe some of the scribes and some of the students of the law. They were in the synagogue. It might have been the Sabbath, and they were questioning Jesus, and it gets pretty intense. Now, the final section of this teaching discourse occurs after he teaches in the synagogue, and it's just to the 12 disciples. And we find out that this is what he said in verses 60 through 71. So it goes from a crowd to the religious thought leaders who are now going to test his thinking, and then finally his disciples. And I want you to notice something. Not everybody that is in the crowd is willing to be a disciple. And sometimes, to really be a disciple of Jesus, you have to not just be drawn by the miracles, just be drawn by the flash, not just be drawn by the excitement. You've got to be drawn by Jesus himself. And you have to be willing to follow what he says and to feed, not just on the miraculous or the emotion, but on the words that he speaks. And that's the message of this passage. So let's begin. Are you with me? John chapter 6 and we're going to pick up in verse 24. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there meaning the place where he had fed them that prior day, nor his disciples, they also got in boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. Notice, when people are seeking Jesus, they're willing to do some things. They're willing to travel. They're willing to see, because people are drawn to Jesus for different reasons. And so they were seeking Jesus. And I want to say that's where it starts. There are some of you watching right now, and you don't know exactly what you think about Jesus. You're not sure how you feel about Jesus, but you're at least curious enough to watch a guy like me talk about Jesus. Some of you are in this building. Some of you are going to be listening by podcast or video broadcast later, and you're seeking to understand Jesus. Maybe you're not ready to throw everything you have and give your whole life to Jesus, but you're in a place of trying to kind of figure out who he is, because let's admit it, whether you're Gandhi or Muhammad himself, all the great leaders of the world that have lived since the first century have all said that the greatest life that's ever been lived is the life of this man from Nazareth named Jesus. They've all acknowledged there's something about him that attracts everyone to him. His historical fact, the fact that he lived, is unquestioned, even by atheists and secularists. But who was he? And why did he change the world after dying just 33 years on the earth? People start seeking Jesus, and that's the place where we start. And in verse 25, it says, they found him on the other side of the sea. And they said to him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Of course, he doesn't tell them, I walked across the sea last night. That's how I got here. He just goes right to the heart of the question. Jesus is going to get a little confrontational now. And I'm going to tell you something. We all love to hear, Jesus loves me. And he does. But sometimes Jesus just gets right in your face and bypasses all of your fluff and gets right to the heart of why you're really there. And that's what Jesus does. So they said, when did you get here? And Jesus answered and said, most assuredly or truly, in other words, this is the truth. That's how it reads in the Greek. This is the real truth. I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, because you saw what I had done, in other words, the miracles that I had done, but because you ate the loaves and were filled. In other words, and you have to understand this, they got free food. Everybody likes free food. You just announce you're going to have some donuts and bagels, and you'll get some people showing up. They might leave after the free coffee and bagels and donuts, but they'll come for that at least. And in this world, they got filled. And now the guy that fed them, and you have to remember, in the ancient world, people struggled to eat. And now they're coming to Jesus, and they're really looking for, it's not even like they saw the sign, they want to know, how did you do that? What is it all about? Their first issue is they want to eat again. They're hungry. They're looking for food, and Jesus knows that. He said, you are looking for me because you ate loaves and were filled. Then he said, don't labor for food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. In other words, don't seek just for the food or the blessings I can give you. And I'm going to tell you this today. We preach an abundant life. We preach a gospel that not just will save your soul, but also practically applied help your natural life. We believe in a God who wants to heal. We believe in a God who wants to help you through your agony and pain, wants to deliver you from your depression, a God who wants to provide for you, who wants to break the spirit of poverty. If there's anything we know about God, is that God is a good Father and a gracious giver. But we should not be seeking Jesus because we're looking for the benefits that come from seeking Jesus. If he never healed you, if he never did anything to fix your situation, if he never answered a single prayer, would you seek Jesus not because of what he can do for you, but because of who he is? That's a question we all have to answer. And it may easily say, well, I'm seeking Jesus for who he is. But you know, when we examine a person's prayer life, what they ask for and what they talk about when they're talking to Jesus, we find out how much of their interest in Jesus is about Jesus. If you know how to pray and ask for things, but you come into church and when it's time to praise and worship, you kind of stand like this and put your hands in your pocket and look at your watch and wait for them to end and maybe go out for the offering so you don't have to deal with that and then just come in to get the message. I'm going to say you're coming to get something for you. But you know, in worship is the one time that we do something that's completely selfless. It's about him. It's about him. It's about Jesus. And so we ought to be people that want him for who he is. True followers of Jesus, he taught us in John 4, are worshipers that seek him and worship him in spirit and in reality. What are you looking for? Jesus said, look for real food, nourishment that endures to everlasting life. There's something more important than your belly being full physically. You are a spiritual being, and your spiritual needs I've come to meet. And Jesus said, the Son of Man, he's speaking of himself, he wants to give you this spiritual food. Now, notice in verse 28, they respond to him with an interesting question. And I want you to just look at it in two ways. Then they said to him, what shall we do that we may work the works of God? Now, this is a very interesting statement because there's two thoughts here. The initial thought you'd have is they're saying to Jesus, okay, you want us to not look to you for food, you want us to look to you for some spiritual food. Okay. Now, what do we have to do to work the works of God? Now, these were religious Jewish people in various stages of devotion, and they understood that God had something he had given to them, which was called the law, and the law had commandments, and their lives were defined by keeping those commandments as they understood them. And so they're saying, what are the key works? What are the works that we must do that will please the Lord? And you know, a lot of times when people start seeking Jesus, they're looking to get from Jesus just the basic data, the core information. Okay, what do I have to do in order to have a relationship with Jesus? What are the works I've got to do? Again, okay, church attendant, what do you believe about this? And what do I have to do as it relates to giving? And what do I have to do as it relates to, is there any kind of special dress code? And what are the works I have to do? I mean, I have to be good, but how good is that really? Is it all the time or most of the time? And so people are always defining themselves as okay based on what they think God requires of them. And so in one sense, they're saying, what are the works that will please God? What are the things we're supposed to do to please God? But there's another thought here, and this is really interesting because in the Greek it can be read this way, and I want to give this to you. They had just seen Jesus multiplied loaves and fishes through the hands of his disciples. The miracle happened in the disciples' hands, not in the prayer. And so there is a way to translate this that's legitimate that says, we want to do the works of God. We want to do the same things you just did. In other words, what are the secrets to the power of multiplying food? What are the secrets? In fact, one translation actually renders it straight out that way. I don't know exactly whether they were asking about, we are seeking the power you have, or we're seeking to know the perfection that's required by God that you would teach us. What are the works or the rules we have to live by? Either way, and I'm going to say both and, Jesus has a response. They're coming to him wanting to know what they can do. And Jesus answered and said this is the work. Notice they asked about the works, plural. Jesus said, this is the work of God. Everybody say the work. In other words, there's one thing that God is focused on. There's one thing, not a bunch of things, that God is asking of you to do. And there's one thing that is required of you, and this is the work, that you believe on him whom he sent. God sent Jesus, and the one work he's asking of the human race since Jesus entered this planet is that we believe him. In fact, it says this, that you believe, what does it say? In him or on him. It's not just believing that Jesus historically existed. It's not just believing that Jesus was a great teacher or a miracle worker or that he was an ethical genius or some kind of a moral champion. No, you've got to believe on him personally. In other words, it's the idea of putting your faith, your trust, all of your life in Jesus as the source of your life. Jesus is making a bold claim. No rabbi would say that in the first century. Not even a greatly respected rabbi would say, you've got to believe on me. Moses didn't say, the way to get to the promised land is to believe on me. He said, this is what God said. We all need to do what God said. But Jesus said, take all of that, put it aside. This is the work God is requiring of the human race from here forward, and that is that you believe in and on Jesus. Your faith in Jesus is the thing God is looking for. It's more important than the blessings God could give you. It's more important than the power he will give you or operate through you and the gifts of the Spirit. It's Jesus. Don't ever forget the thing that separates or distinguishes, this is a better word, that distinguishes Christians, true Christians, from every other group or people in the world. It's not that we're better than other people or smarter than other people or better looking than other people or wealthier or more powerful in the natural. It's not any of that. The distinguishing characteristic of a true Christian or follower of Christ is our devotion, singular, to the person of Jesus. We have faith in Jesus, what he said, what he did, and what he has promised and is doing right now in our lives. We are followers of Jesus. Back in the 70s, there was a move of the Holy Spirit that swept through the western parts of the United States. And it swept really through the beaches of Southern California, and then it kind of took off up in Northern California, right on the heels of Haight-Ashbury, right on the heels of the race riots, right on the heels of the hippie movement. There was this sudden sovereign move of God where these kids that were dropping out and getting, and I don't remember the three things, drop out, drop in, drops, I don't know. They were the young people that were kind of they were disconnected from society. They were called sometimes the hippie culture. There were thousands of them that suddenly found Jesus. And one of the things about these people that you'll read when you read about this group of people that found Jesus, many of them were high when they found Jesus, or had just gotten hungover from the night before, or in the middle of some of the craziest sin you can imagine. Jesus would appear to them, or speak to them, or minister to them, or somebody would talk to them, and they would like fall in love with Jesus. And these people, these young people, were known as the Jesus people. How many of you remember the Jesus people? What a phenomenon. And so there were literally millions of young people, and really what's called contemporary Christian music. That's Christian music that doesn't sound like it's been played in an old cathedral with a pipe organ. The drums coming into the church, guitars coming into all of that. The contemporary Christian music movement came out of the Jesus people, because they were playing Bob Dylan, so they just began to change the words and sing to Jesus. And so anyway, that movement was a real powerful move of God. And the one thing I want to say about that was awesome, and I believe God is about to do something like that again in this nation and around the world with these young people. He loves them so much. But I'm going to say this to you. The one thing that was really distinctive about the Jesus People movement was that they identified themselves not by the church they went to, though they went to church, not by the clothes they wore, certainly, not by their behaviors externally. They defined themselves as the Jesus People. Jesus. I follow Jesus. I love Jesus. And at the end of the day, we have a church with a name that God gave us, Abundant Life. We are Christians, followers of Christ. We are, we follow a kind of a charismatic evangelical reformed theology. We can find ourselves in the streams of historic Christianity, but take all of the labels away. What are we? We are the Jesus people. We love Jesus. We're a part. We don't just go to church. Listen. Church is a people. We come to the people of God that happen to meet in a building. But we are the church. We meet here on Sundays and Wednesdays and other times. But we are the church. Well, what is the church? The church of the people who've devoted their lives to Jesus. It's all about Jesus at the end of the day. Are you loving him? Are you worshiping him? Are you listening to him? Are you following him? Are you reading his words? Because all these things bring us back to him. Whew. And they said to him, he said, the work is to believe in me. And they said to him, therefore, now notice this, what sign will you perform that we may believe in you? What work will you do? Get this, first they're seeking his blessings, then they're seeking his powers, and then they're seeking his moral perfections, his requirements. Now they want more signs and miracles. These are the people that just got fed the day before. To say, okay, you want us to believe in you. Show us something else, David Blaine. What else can you pull out of your pocket? Give us some show, a sign, so that we can believe. I mean, think about it. And then they said, now listen, our fathers, what are they still after? What are they after? Our fathers ate manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. In other words, do the bread thing again. And they know enough Bible to say, when Moses wanted people to follow him, he gave them manna. And that wasn't just a one-time deal. He could do it over and over again. So they probably have some, grandmas now in the crowd, and they brought some other folks and do the bread thing again. And they quote the Bible to make it spiritual. And then Jesus said to them, most assuredly, which means I'm telling you the truth right now. I'm cutting through all of the stuff. I'm going to give it to you right straight. Moses did not give you bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. In other words, it didn't come from Moses. It came from God. And now you have true bread from heaven, right from God. For the bread of God is He who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Stop thinking naturally. There's something more important than your belly, and it's me. Now, he was either an egomaniac, he was a maniac, which means he was insane, or he was a manipulative liar. But if his goal was to get followers, this is the worst possible way to do it. Or he was exactly who he said he was. He said, I'm the one that's come down. God's giving you me. What more could you want? If it was just a human saying that, we'd all walk away and say, okay, you're a narcissist. Verse 33, for the bread of God is He who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And they said to him, now notice, Lord, give us this bread always. In other words, okay, just make sure the bread keeps coming. Give us this bread always. They're still not thinking about Him. They're thinking about manna, which showed up every morning. Whatever it is, give us this bread always. Does this sound familiar? Do you remember a few chapters ago, Jesus is in Samaria talking to the real housewife of Samaria, and He promised her what? He said, if you knew who it was who was talking to you, you would ask Him and He would give you living water. You drink this water and you'll get thirsty again. You drink the water that I will give you and you'll never thirst. And she said, oh, Lord, give me this water always so that I'll never thirst. I'm sure, give me the water that I'll just drink it once. Show me. She's not getting it. He's not talking about physical water. He's talking about spiritual water. He's not talking about physical bread. He's talking about a spiritual sustenance and nourishment that comes from Him. And so, verse 34, they said to Him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. Notice two things, coming and believing. Coming and believing. Coming to Jesus, and you don't just come to Him to explore, you then come to believe. And if you're in this place today, Jesus is saying to you the same thing He said to them. You are seeking, but you need to seek more than the signs or the blessings or some personal provision. You need to seek Jesus Himself. And if you come to Jesus, and if you'll come with your faith in Jesus, He will give you something that will satisfy the searching, seeking questions in your heart. He may not intellectually satisfy every question that you have. He didn't come to satisfy our intellectual questions, although believing in Him is not anti-intellectual. He came to satisfy your spiritual quest. Because let's face it, no matter how many degrees you get, how many classes you take, how many books you read, you're not satisfied. It doesn't scratch the real itch, because the itch that we have isn't just for answers to intellectual questions and mysteries. The itch that we have is for purpose and meaning. Why am I here? Who made me? And what is this all about? And Jesus is the answer to all of those questions. In verse 36, Jesus now begins to give us a powerful set of statements. And we have to let these statements sit in our hearts. He's going to tell us that He came from heaven on a mission. He had a purpose. And His mission was, well, we know in part, to offer His life for the sins of the world. John 3:16 told us that. God loved the world so much, he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him would not die or perish or be lost, but have everlasting life. Jesus came to provide life to the world. But there's also another truth we have to grapple with, and it's right here in the text. And that is that God, who knows the end from the beginning and knew you before you were born, has determined that the way a person comes to him is through his Son, Jesus. He sent his Son as the agency, the agent by which you come to him, the Father. And what you do with the Son is what you do with the Father. You reject the Son, you reject the Father. You receive the Son, you get the Father. And we're going to find out that God, in his infinity and eternality, and is the one who created both time and space, sees time and space not from a linear perspective, but from an eternal perspective, which is why he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He's with us now, he's with Jesus, and he's on the cross, and he's with all of us around the throne 1,000 years from now, all at once in a time perspective to us, but to God, it's all one, because God is everywhere present in space and time at once. Therefore, God knows the future because he is in the future. And the Bible says that God knows those who will believe and those who will not. In fact, he even singles out one particular follower who really wasn't following in faith by the end of this chapter, Judas. And Jesus is going to tell us, because now he's being tested by these folks. Jesus is going to tell us that Jesus came down offering his life to everyone, but knowing that there were some in particular that he came to get. And these people were given to him by the Father before the foundation of the world. So with those thoughts in mind, let's read. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. Verse 37. All that the Father gives me will come to me. And the one who comes to me, I will by no means cast out. In other words, if you come to Jesus, you won't be rejected. For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. There's a mission. He came with a mission. And now he's going to tell us what the mission is. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given to me, I should lose none or nothing, but should raise it up at the last day, or raise them up at the last day. This is the mission. I came for this group of people he calls the Father has given to me. Now, God really invites the whole world to be saved, and anybody in this room can come to Jesus. If you come in faith, you can come and believe, and you'll have everlasting life. But I want you to understand this. God doesn't say, oh, I'm so glad Peter got saved today. God doesn't turn to the angels and say, did you see that? You know, Tanya was she was so messed up, so screwed up. She wouldn't listen to us. We sent people to tell her about me. She wouldn't follow me. But look at this. Today in church, she came to Jesus, and she gave her life to me. Isn't that wonderful? Now I have her. In fact, when a person comes to Jesus, although all of heaven rejoices, Jesus is not surprised. Because when Jesus came down to the earth, God gave him a list. All the Father has given, which means God has given out of the world some to Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean the whole world couldn't come to Jesus, but God in his wisdom knows those who would come. And those were given to Jesus, and Jesus said this, I have a deal with the Father, that of all those he gives me, I will lose none of them. So they will come, they'll be saved, they won't be cast out, and here's the big deal. If they come to me, I will receive them, and I will, now we're going to the future, raise them up at the last day. In other words, I will finish what I started in them. which means the will of God is not just for you to be saved, but the will of God to Jesus. The promise between the Father and Jesus is the Father gave Jesus the list, and Jesus said, I will die for them, I will draw them, I will save them, and I will keep them, and on the last day, I will raise them up. What I'm saying is this, that when you decide to come to Jesus, if you come to Jesus in faith, He already knew you were coming and you were on the list, and you came because He came to get you. You were seeking Him, but before you started seeking Him, He was seeking you. And when you got saved, you entered into a deal, an arrangement. It's not an arrangement between you and God. It's an arrangement between the Father and the Son. And the Father and the Son made this deal. And here's the deal. If you come, you are accepted. And Jesus said, I will raise them up at the last days. I won't lose any of them. None. 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 You know what that means? If we get to heaven and the roll is called up yonder, and the Father says, where's Mike? Mike Curley. Jesus will say, he's right here. I got him. Good, check it off. Next name in the book of life. Bobby Coleman. Where's Bobby Coleman? He was a tough one. I didn't know if he was going to stick, but I worked with him, and by my Spirit and my grace, I've kept him, and he's here. We raised him up. He's here, Father. Check it off. Now, where's that Hank Perry fellow? Father, I know we made a deal, and Hank was on the list. And he came, and I accepted him, but he fell into some hard times, and he just began to be deceived by the enemy, and he began to fall back into his own old life, and he didn't act right, and I just couldn't keep something like that. So I lost him. Oops. You think we preach an easy believism. You don't even know what you're talking about. Believing in the eternal salvation of the elect, or that those who are saved eternally, is not a faith in your ability to stay saved or to keep going or to be faithful. It's not based on the rules you keep or forget to keep. It's not about you. Our faith is in a promise Jesus made to His Father that gives us comfort, that said, I won't lose any of them, but we'll raise them up in the last day. So if you start the trip, you finish the trip. And if you don't like it, take it up with Jesus. And just to make sure we get it, I got to stop at verse 40, but... And notice this, it's very emphatic in the Greek. This is the will of Him who sent me. I'm going to say, listen, this is the will of God. I've met a lot of very serious Christians who don't believe you can lose your salvation and say, you must obey the will of God. The will of God cannot be broken. Amen. Well, here's the will of God. This is the will of God. And if this will is broken, that means that God isn't God. Or that Jesus can't keep the will of God, because it wasn't a deal between God and you. It's a deal between God and Jesus. This is the will of Him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in Him may have everlasting, not just temporary, everlasting life. And to make sure we get it, and I will raise him up at the last day. They start, they will finish. Paul said it this way, I'm confident of this very thing, that He which has begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. It's not about you being perfect. It's about Him keeping it. One way or the other, if you've really come in faith and you're really His, you can rest in the assurance that your salvation isn't a license to sin. In fact, if you really belong to Jesus and you really love Him, sin is not what you're looking for, because your heart's been changed. Sin makes you miserable. What you're really looking for is a life that flows from the life of God. Hallelujah. Of all the Father's given to me, who does the Father give to Jesus? How do I get on the list? How do I get on the list? Now, this is where we differ from our Presbyterian friends who would say that God decides who goes on the list, and he's decided who can't be on the list, and he helps some and prevents others. Doesn't square with the Bible. Jesus came to save the whole world. He died for the sins of the whole world. He reaches out his hands to everyone, but he knows who will come in faith. The question is this: are you seeking Jesus for his power? Are you seeking him for his blessing, the bread, what he can do for you? Are you seeking him for some secondary thing that's about you? Or are you coming to Jesus because it's Jesus? Because he's the true bread. He's the gift that came from heaven. Do you see Jesus not just as a guru, as a teacher, as a historical figure, as an extraordinary magician? Do you see Jesus as more than some esoteric, elevated Hindu yoga master? Do you see him as more than a force manipulator? Do you see him as he claimed to be? None other than the Son of the living God, God in flesh, given for the life of the world. And will you come to Jesus, see him as he is, and believe in him and love him for who he is? Hallelujah. Because if you will, you're on the list. God already knew. And the comfort is that when you come, you know you're accepted, and you know that Jesus has you, and that one way or the other, the Father and Jesus are going to get you to that final moment where your body, soul, and spirit are completely transformed at the coming of the Lord. Hallelujah. That's the will of God given to Jesus. Do you have faith in that? So if you're here today and you say, I've come to Jesus, I believe in Jesus, but I'm struggling in my life, I get that. We all do. But I want you to take comfort from the promise that Jesus knows how to keep you. And just keep coming to him. This is a call to believers to keep their eyes on Jesus and not the blessings. To keep your eyes on Jesus and love him and follow him and define your life by him. Peace will come and blessings will be at his right hand.